Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to our continuing story of Pensacola, North America's first place city. Today we begin the tale of our great fishing industry, an industry which for well over half a century was one of the pillars of the economy here. Of course, today, in the 21st century, we look at fishing in a different mode. For example, many weekends during the summertime, there are great contests where people go out on charter boats and bring in huge deep sea fish. There are many people, of course, who enjoy fishing as a sport, and we have fishing piers and continuing efforts to build even more of them. People talk about the gathering of material for creation of fishing reefs, such as we developed with the sinking a few years ago of the naval vessel Oriskany. All of these things, of course, are coming into play, and in addition to that, of course, we have one of our principal visitor attractions is Joe Patty's Market, a fish market down on the waterfront, which not only has the many things for sale, but also gives people the treat of seeing some of the real fishing boats which are docked nearby. But the story of fishing in Pensacola goes back a long way. When we talked about our DeLuna episodes some time back, we wondered why, in the case of the literal starvation which these people were suffering, why they could not bring fish and shellfish out of the bay. That still remains a mystery. However, by the time we come to the Areola colony of the early 17th century, or 18th century, we also begin to see fishing here. And this, of course, was men going out into the bay and bringing in a catch which would be part of the diet of the people who lived here. The same was true when we had the British period, and then into the final Spanish period, and ultimately into the early American times of the 19th century. In that time, we have little tales of how people of that era made their living by going out on a boat early in the morning and literally going street to street with their catch, shouting out their wares, and the housewife, the homemaker, would come out and take the fish. This, of course, is long before there was such a thing as ice or ice preservation or a refrigerator. Now, as far as the actual deep sea commercial fishing here, our story really begins not with local people, but with a group of very adventurous fishermen from New England. This was in the early 1840s. And these people literally rebuilt certain New England fishing smacks so that they would hold a tremendous amount of ice. These men would cut ice off of the ponds in New England, bring their ships around the Keys, and would fish off of the waters of Pensacola for some time. Their catch would be iced down, and they would sell it back to people along the Atlantic coast, beginning in South Florida, and then, of course, moving up through Charleston, Savannah, and so on. And it was a very profitable business. Pensacola merchants liked it because from time to time these vessels had to come in here for additional supplies, and the people got along just fine. But in the same period, in the 1840s, an invention came into play which would affect the fishing industry some years later. About 150 miles to the east of Pensacola is the little village of Appleyard. And in the 1840s, one of the residents there was a physician, Dr. John Gorey. And Dr. Gorey, of course, was troubled in the summertime. He would have fever patients and had a great deal of trouble keeping them cool. And so John Gorey was not only a physician, he was a tinkerer. And I have no idea how he did this, but he developed a mechanical method for creating ice. And so we credit Dr. Gorey with the beginnings of that great industry. In fact, people of Florida were so grateful to him that when the Statuary Hall was developed in the United States Capitol, John Gorey is one of the two figures from the state of Florida who stand there representing things that have happened here. Well, all of this, of course, passed through. We went into the time of the war between the states and the early years after the war, and nothing changed as far as fishing was concerned. Basically, all that was done would be for catch for local consumption and absolutely nothing else. In 1870, and we must look on that year as a sort of a magic year for Pensacola, in 1870, all of these things, several new things, began to come together. First of all, the great railroad, the Pensacola and Atlantic, was rebuilt and now had a route from Pensacola up to the new junction at Flomaton, and where at this point it connected with other portions of the L&N system. Now we had a rail route to the north. At the same time, a German gentleman by the name of George Eras arrived in Pensacola, and he opened a commercial ice factory, an ice plant that was capable of producing about 20,000 pounds of ice every day. Now we had the railroad and we had ice. Now you put those two together and you have the beginnings of an opportunity to catch fish in the waters off Pensacola and then deliver those fish to markets to the north. Now, of course, before that could happen, there had to be experiments in railroading. The idea of transporting fresh material, whether it be fruits, vegetables, or fish, had to go through a sort of historic renaissance, if you will. And we have to credit people in California with the beginning of it. They were the ones who made the first experiments of trying to ice down fresh vegetables that were being produced in that state. And the first efforts failed. But by the time we get to 1870, changes had been made, and they had learned that you could do certain things to the walls of a boxcar to kind of insulate it. This is long before real, genuine commercial insulation was developed, of course. But then also, they had a different way of icing down. Envision, if you will, a typical boxcar empty. If we're icing down any transportable, perishable material, they would put large boxes in each of the four corners of the car, and they would fill these with ice, and there would be a mechanism on the car for removing water once that ice melted. Then, if we talk about a typical shipment of fish, the fish would be brought into a warehouse. The fish would be cleaned, packed in barrels, packed solidly with ice, and then of course they'd have the iced barrels plus the ice boxes in the corners of the car, and the car would leave the city here and would move north. And the arrangement that was made after considerable experimentation, I might add, after that experimentation was successful, a car would move from here, say, as far as Birmingham. And at that point, the track people, the people in the yard there, would go out and remove the water from where the ice had melted in the ice boxes on the corners of the car, and they would then refill those boxes with new ice so that the car could continue in a cold condition. That enabled people here in Pensacola to ship ship fresh fish, first of all, about as far as Louisville, and then on to Cincinnati, and then within about 25 years, the fish were being shipped all the way to Chicago. So this is the mechanism, the method that was developed here for handling fish. We had Mr. Eras, and of course a second ice maker named George Stratton, who also entered the business. So Pensacola was getting ready. Also in 1870, with these other parts now known and available, a man arrived here from Massachusetts, a man named Sewell Cobb. Now, Mr. Cobb had been in this business for a long time up in New England. He was an experienced fisherman, and he brought with him several typical New England fishing smacks. And he made arrangements with the city to lease property on the Palafox Pier. So now, by the end of the year 1870, we have Mr. Sewell here, Mr. Sewell Cobb here with his warehouse. We have his fishing smacks, and we have, of course, the arrangement for getting ice. And there's a railroad siding there to put all of this together. And Mr. Cobb begins by sending his vessels out into the area just not too far south of Pensacola, into the Gulf. But before long, it became obvious to Mr. Cobb, as it would to subsequent commercial fishing leaders, that there was better fishing farther away, because the bottom of the Gulf out here basically was not nearly as attractive to snapper and grouper and the other table fish as land areas on the bottom of the Gulf, somewhat to the south off Campeche, some 400 to 500 miles from Pensacola. But Mr. Cobb proceeded. And over the decade of the 70s, he began our fishing enterprise. Now, of course, you still had the little local commercial sale of fish. This was the peddlers who had gone up and down the streets shouting their wares to the homemaker. That was still there. But the homemakers, some of them now at least, had the advantage that they could go down to Mr. Eras or Mr. Stratton and buy ice. And by the time we get to the year 1880, Stratton and Eras had gone beyond that, and they now were selling ice commercially door to door using wagons wagons, of course, to make the distribution. So that was a part of an ongoing part of our trade in Pensacola itself, and this was something that had come basically, I guess we would call it by the evolution of the trade. We get to 1880. And by this time, the market for freshly caught fish was growing, particularly in the Middle West. And so in 1880, we have a competitor arrive, for a competitor to Sewell Cobb, and his name was Andrew Fuller Warren. Mr. Warren also was from New England, and he brought with him a pair of the fishing smacks, and he also had with him his son-in-law, a man by the name of Silas Stearns. And these men put together a new fishing enterprise, not on Palafox Pier where Cobb was operating, but this time on the Balin Street Wharf, where they put together the Warren Fish Company and also the Warren Fish House. And their enterprise begins. The mechanism was about the same. They went to the same grounds. They used the same icing arrangement. And of course, by now, the railroad was deeply into the fishing business, and it was becoming one of the biggest commercial advantages for this railroad here, the Pensacola and Atlantic. Well, we must stop for just a minute and talk about Silas Stearns. Stearns was not just a fisherman, he was a scientist. And as he worked here a year, 2 years, 3 years, he began to go out into the Gulf and to analyze the places where fish were caught, and to analyze how many fish were there, how large was this fish population. And Stearns began to say, now look, we have to be careful. Fish are like anything else. You can certainly depopulate and unless you are careful and regulate how much of the catch you take every year. So we have to look at Silas Stearns as the first fishing environmentalist, and he did a lot, at least on paper, to make the fishing industry realize that care must be given. Unfortunately, not everyone listened to what Mr. Stearns said, and as a result of that, well, even in the 21st century, the fishing industry, commercial fishermen and pleasure fishermen realize that there are limits to what one can take out of the Gulf. Well, Mr. Stearns, of course, had a fine-looking daughter, and along the way, that daughter was married to a man by the name of William Hayes. And Mr. Hayes came on board as a part of the same Warren Fish Company. And just about in the middle of the 1880s, I don't have the specific date, Mr. Stearns sickened and died, and his place within the firm was taken by William Hayes. So we have all of that organization developing. And bear in mind that the Warren Fish Company, brought to Pensacola in 1880, would be the last of the surviving commercial fishing enterprises that we had here of any size. Okay, we come now to the year 1882, and now we have the third onset of a major commercial fishing company. And this one was brought here by two men, both again from New England. One of them was named Eugene Saunders, and his assistant, was named Thomas E. Wells. Now, Saunders had made a lot of money, not necessarily in fishing so much, but he had operated a fleet of large seagoing tugs, which could handle barges of large size up and down the Atlantic coast, and that's basically where he made his money. Thomas Wells, on the other hand, was a man who had grown up in the fishing industry in Massachusetts. He was a master of that trade. So these men came, and as the others, Sewell Cobb and Andrew Fuller Warren had come, Saunders and Wells brought their equipment. They leased additional property right next to where Sewell Cobb's fishing warehouse, cleaning warehouse was on Palafox Pier, and they began their enterprise at the same place. And so, as we close down the episode number 1, we have 3 different fishing companies operating out of here, doing a increasingly large business. And of course, with each passing year, they learn more and more about how to catch fish and how to approach the areas south of Pensacola. And the industry was growing, and it was, by the time we get into the early 1890s, we have not only fishing, of course, the great lumbering industry that was here. We have naval stores that are producing it, and we are now in an era when Pensacola is really beginning to boom. Our economic future looks bright indeed.